Good afternoon. There are very many people who have been working hard for the conference, and most people who are in charge in different tasks have made a very good job. But the person who was in charge of the weather didn't do very well. But hopefully during the next days it will be better than today. So I have the honor to introduce you the keynote speaker of today, Professor Jouni Välijärvi. He is a professor of education at the University of Jyväskylä and the director of the Finnish Institute of Educational Research. The institute is very special. It is part of the university, but it has a strong national duty to carry out evaluation studies, and Jouni is known Mr. PISA in Finland. He has been running the big international evaluation studies and have been interpreting the results, explaining it to the big audience, politicians, teachers, and has been very busy in doing that. And what is very important in his approach, he really has tried to understand the results of these international studies within a societal context, without drawing these typical superficial conclusions which we typically see when people are interpreting the results of international comparison studies. I personally had the opportunity to learn to know Jouni already quite early on. We were young researchers in 1970s working in the project of Finnish Ministry of Education, and were in the many seminars together, and I already at that time noticed that this is a very serious thinker. Jouni finished her PhD 1993, but has made already before that a long career as a researcher in this Finnish Institute for Educational Research. He has been advisor in many projects in OECD and many countries around the world. And now we have the opportunity to hear what he has to say for us. Jouni, please.
Okay, good afternoon, dear friends, dear researchers, dear colleagues, and thank you, Erno, for your kind words. I'm not quite sure if you were punctual, that I'm not anymore the director of the institute. I stepped down from that position in the beginning of this month, and now, to be honest, I feel much more relaxed than a month or a couple of months ago, because I don't have any responsibility about other persons, only about myself. But in my presentation, I will raise some issues about these international comparative studies, comparative assessments, or large-scale assessments, as they are called in the language of these studies typically. And as Erno mentioned, mainly I have been working in PISA study. I was the coordinator of PISA study in Finland from 1998 until last year, when the results of PISA 2015 were published. So I have some perspective on the study, especially on national level, but of course also some ideas about and some experience about international collaboration, and I will raise some issues about this and also make some comments on that critiques that has been raised about these studies. So my main topics today are, first of all, how education, economy, and the idea of competencies are related to each other. This is one important point to understand, that when we are speaking about these large-scale assessments, behind that is very much the experience and idea that education is more and more important condition for economical growth, economical development, and of course behind PISA, this thinking has been very strong. I don't try to deny that, but I will also try to explain what it has meant in the reality of research activities from my point of view. And then I would raise some issues about international comparative assessment in general, because PISA is not the only one. There are a lot of, and quite a long history behind these studies. And my point is that we should, as researchers, to be familiar with this tradition. What are the advantages, what are the weaknesses of this tradition, and how we could utilize all that data and all that understanding about international educational, on international level about educational systems more effectively in the future. Then some experiences about impact of PISA on school education, especially in Finland, but also internationally. And finally, I try to raise also some ideas how we could utilize, how we could discuss about the possibilities to use all this huge data that we gather in these international studies for different purposes in educational research, not only for league tables, which are familiar from newspapers and public debate. There are a lot of other possibilities which are utilized more or less in international research activities, but there are also a lot of possibilities what we could do better in the future. And finally, I will give some examples how we have analyzed PISA data in Finland to understand, hopefully a little bit more deeply, our system, how does it look and how it's working compared to other educational systems in the world. I'm not speaking about league tables or that kind of issues, but giving some examples how we can analyze our own system from different perspectives. So first of all, some talks about role of economy or relationship between education and economy and educational research and research on economy, and how that relationship is changing and how it has strengthened within the couple of few years. And where the most of this data can be found is, of course, OECD, that is also behind PISA study. They had many projects already before PISA, and they have also some assessments before PISA, but also more theoretically oriented project where these ideas were very much discussed. This DESECO project is maybe the most important if you think of PISA, but for instance, project called EARLI was before that quite many years, where the basic ideas, basic principles for those large-scale assessments that OECD has conducted was created. And the term competence was raised very much in this project, and what competence means in that context. It's something like this, what is here on this slide, that competence is more than just knowledge or skills. It involves the ability to meet complex demands by drawing on and mobilizing psychological resources, including skills and attitudes in particular context. In this definition is very much the idea of that kind of assessment studies, what, for instance, PISA represent, that it's not only knowing and being able to repeat what have been learned in school or outside it, it's more testing how able people are utilize these resources in different contexts, and later I will show some examples what it has meant in PISA when constructing tests for 15-year-olds. If we think of education and economy, the traditional model and research on this area has been very much investigating two things in national level. One, how educational system is covering population. Is it covering the whole population or only part of that? And the other tradition is, or the key question has been, how long is the education on average, and how it's varying among populations. So very much the length and coverage of education. These have been the two basic variables in analyzing the impact of education on economy, traditionally in economical research on education. And there are a lot of research showing, for instance, what is the impact of education on the salaries of people in their later career, and it's quite obvious. I think it's very common understanding that this correlation it's clear, and education is good investment on individual level. But if we take a look on economical research on education nowadays, it goes more to the quality of education. What is the quality of cognitive skills of people? How able people are to use their skills and knowledge in different contexts. Job labor market is one context, but this is not the only one. Maybe for economical researchers it's the most important, but we have to remember that from this point of view, and also in these international studies, we think of this context more broadly than only job where people are working, and how they are changing, and what kind of demands for cognitive skills they set nowadays. So one important reason why OECD became interested in studies like PISA and also, for instance, BIAC, that is quite similar study on the whole adult population, is that interest or understanding that the quality of education, the results of education are more important than just the length of education or the coverage, how it's covering the population on different levels. So then it means that we have to have understanding about that, what people can do with all that knowledge and skills, what they have learned in school or outside school. This, to my understanding, is the main reason why OECD became interested in education from this point of view already quite early on 90s and partly already on 80s, and then finally at the end of beginning of the millennium we see that this also in concrete level in PISA study. But before I go further in this analyzing PISA and its role related to education, I want to remind that PISA is not the starting point of large-scale assessment or this kind of comparative studies. In educational research, we have a long tradition on comparative perspective. It goes many, I think, many hundred years, but more on qualitative, from qualitative perspective, comparing educational systems and factors related to that. But also when we think of the learning outcomes and the productivity of educational systems from this point of view, what are the results, what is the level of knowledge and skills that students reach during the school years. Interest on this question has raised already quite early. It goes back more than 50 years. Already on 1960, we had the first IEA study that was focusing on quite many topics on basic education. It was more or less still a pilot study, but anyway, it was a starting point for all that kind of activities, what we can see nowadays, for instance, in PISA, TIMSS, PEARLS, PIAC, and some other studies, civic study, where the focus is in civic and citizenship education, health education, where the World Health Organization has been active, but has followed very similar methodological lines as these other studies. So the history goes back more than 50 years. And for instance, Torsten Hussein from Sweden was one of the founding fathers of these activities, one of the founding fathers of International Association for the Evaluation for Educational Achievement, IEA, that's still nowadays conducting most of these studies. And Benjamin Bloom, who created this criteria for assessment, and that everybody knows is his model. He was one of the founding fathers of this organization and these studies. But what makes difference to PISA and OECD is that behind these activities was very much research interest. All these persons were researchers, and it was research cooperation, especially in the beginning. Nowadays also in IEA we can see different kind of organizations participating in these activities, not only research institutes, but also ministries and research institute close to policy level. But anyway, this is important to keep in mind, and also that we have a lot of data from different levels of educational system, not only the end of compulsory education, but also on primary level, typically in IEA studies from 4th graders, 10, 11-year-olds, and also some data from upper secondary level, covering grades 9, 10, 11, 12, typically in different educational systems. And then OECD came to the field as a research as a research program, as this was called from the very beginning. The idea of PISA and what was their thinking was that PISA is not just a single study like most of these IEA studies were before. There were similar studies, but not, but more or less on temporary basis. It was very much depending on the funding of the studies and how different countries participated in the studies. There was no program for following and making trends about learning outcomes before PISA. Nowadays also in IA studies they are program-based, they are repeated on between certain years in the same way as PISA, in PISA case every third year. But from the very beginning, PISA has raised questions about what are the interests of OECD launching this kind of research program. Is it something that where the main interest is take economical perspective more deeply into the education, to make education tool for economical growth and all those interests which were in the heart of OECD as an economical organizations. They were discussed already in the beginning, very much also in my institute and also in Finland among researchers, what is really coming, and also what will be the impact of study program that is conducted by OECD as a strong economical international organization, because our experience before that was that what we were doing in this large-scale assessment, the impact on national level was very limited. There was very small interest, very limited interest. Even we could show, for instance, that Finland was doing in reading very well already in 1995 in IEA reading literacy study, but very few people were interested, very few people in ministry reacted at all. That's why this question about the impact of education, what will be the social impact was raised, and I think this was also behind OECD strategy, that they really wanted to strengthen the impact, social impact of these studies. What is the relationship between research and education policy making? It was raised by many researchers. For my institute, maybe it was not such a big problem, because in Finland we have been always seen important to work together with policymakers, with ministry people. In a small country, we don't want to lose our resources for struggling all the time with policymakers or ministry people. We have more, let's say, collaborative tradition to working together and to be part of the university as my institute. That has made it the situation more stable for this kind of equal understanding about the importance of the research. But if you take a look on how the PISA was organized from the beginning, what was stressed very much that conducting the study program, it must be organized by the experts on educational research and research institutes. So in the beginning, Australian Council for Educational Research was the main coordinator of these studies, and studies as such, starting from the sampling and defining target population in different countries, constructing tests. All this was done by experts on educational research and education education and teaching on these different domains, reading, mathematics, and science. And one important, or maybe the most important group of experts are these expert groups behind each of these three domains, where the leading experts, for instance, in mathematics teaching are members of these groups who are, for instance, constructing the tests and deciding what kind of items are included into the test and how they are organized. So in that sense, from the very beginning, it has been very clear to keep research activities and policy making separate from each other as much as it's possible. But one very important practice that was that came typical after PISA or in the very beginning of PISA was that all databases were open to all researchers. In this earlier large-scale assessment, it was very typical that or the tradition was that databases were not open for other researchers. The ownership of data was in each country in that institute that has conducted the national activities. But in this sense, PISA was one of their thinking was very different. And if you think of open access principles today in universities, in this time, PISA was representing this idea very, very clearly. And it was really challenging the tradition of large-scale assessment because the question about ownership came into that very different perspective in that discussions, and in some cases this discussion was not very constructive. There were a lot of quite critical and also difficult discussions about the ownership of the data. But anyway, after that, this practice has delivered also to other large-scale assessment and also in all IEA studies. Now the practice is it's clear that databases are open to all researchers after the first results have been published. That is, of course, very important for possibilities to utilize the data also for different purposes. But what PISA stressed from the very beginning and still today is stressing in assessment and in investigating the learning outcomes was this idea about authentic assessment, as it's called in PISA language. And in practice, it means exactly what I said already earlier. It's not just investigating what students know in science, reading, and mathematics, but the basic question, what they can do with all that they know. And in PISA language and in PISA ideology, it also means that the focus is not so much in school curriculum as it was in earlier IEA studies and still today is, where the question is how students have reached those goals that has set in national curricula and what they have learned and how they have learned compared to the targets of national curricula. In PISA, it's defined very clearly that it's not so important where you have learned. The most important thing, what you can do with all that learning. So going more into the idea of lifelong learning and learning outside the traditional institutes like school. It doesn't matter so much. And that's why in PISA we have some analysis about national curricula. It's asked how items are related to national curricula. We are always making that kind of analysis. Are they included? Are this kind of topics included in national curricula? But it's not very much in the focus of the study. where, compared to IA studies where the items are selected basing on this criteria. They must be included in most countries' curricula, for instance. The other difference compared to earlier studies in PISA, and that makes it, that also raises some challenges, is how target population is defined. In PISA, defining target population it's age-based. It's the target population are students who were born on that, who turned 15 years on that year when the study was conducted. So here it's more precisely defined. But basically, it means that students who turned 15 years on that year when study is conducted. There's some flexibility in national level, but it doesn't make very big difference. But the other important factor here is in defining target population, that it's covering only students who are enrolled in educational institution on grade 7 or higher in educational systems. And IA studies traditionally and still today, it's a grade-based definition. It's mainly 4th graders or 8th graders, and of course also in those studies only covering students who are in educational institution on that age. But this makes some differences in practical level, because in PISA we have to gather 15-year-olds from different levels, covering different grades, for instance in our case from grade 7 even until grade 10, and some cases even to grade 11, mainly on grade 7, on grade 9, but it makes it in practice quite challenging to find all these students in educational system. Some other countries where repeating classes is more typical, it's still much more challenging to follow this definition. But in this large-scale assessment, this definition of the target population is always quite a difficult issue, because it always means that you have to select either students with quite similar age or students who have same amount of education behind their educational in their educational career. And PISA, this is a selection that it's age-based. But what does it mean in practice, and what does it mean when we are comparing the results of these studies? It means that the coverage of 15-year-olds is slightly different in different countries. Even among European countries, where we easily think that all 15-year-olds are still in education, that doesn't seem the case. There are some countries where only around 80% of population is in education institutes, and that's one reason we have to be even when comparing results between European countries, we have to be careful or not take them too strictly, small differences between countries, because that coverage, when it's, for instance, 80% those who are outside the educational system, that's not a random sample of the whole population, because it's selected, related to their knowledge and skills. But then, of course, it's more challenging when we cover countries where this coverage is only around 50%. For instance, Vietnam, who is on a very high level in rankings, and where the variation between learning outcomes is one of the smallest, where the there are very few poorly performing, weakly performing students. The coverage is less than 50% of the whole 15-year-olds population. This is just reminding that there are this kind of challenges when we are trying to compare whole population on national level. We have to be careful at least in some cases. Then going a little bit deeper into the contents of PISA study, what this authentic assessment means in practice, how it has changed the traditional ideas about knowledge and skills, for instance, in this case, in mathematics, and how PISA has challenged traditional ideas of what we have earlier understood with being, for instance, good in mathematics or science, or being a good reader. This is how mathematical literacy, this literacy is the term that is used in defining what we are trying to measure in PISA. It's not mathematics skills and knowledge as such, but it's defined as mathematical literacy. And this is how it was defined in 2003. And as you can see, there are many traditional terms which have defined mathematics in school context earlier, but there are also quite many definitions which are enlarging the idea about mathematical literacy to the context where students are living, especially after their school time. And this is indicating the idea about how students are able to use their skills and knowledge in different contexts, in work, in living as a citizen in modern world, in the further studies, and so on, in their everyday life. But what is also here interesting compared to some other earlier definings, that also engagement is included into the definition of mathematical literacy. It's not only cognitive knowledge and skills, it's also engagement, how engaged students are in mathematics, how they, what is their self-efficacy and this kind of issues when we go to practical operational level. But this definition of mathematical literacy from 2015 also shows that when certain kind of steps are taken which are challenging the traditional idea of our quite traditional terms like mathematics, mathematical knowledge and skills, being qualified in mathematics, we are also challenging these traditions quite deeply in some cases. And in mathematics, if you have followed what happened around mathematical literacy in PISA after 2003 and many years after that, there was a lot of critical discussions about that definition and how mathematics was tested in PISA. The main critics came from the experts in mathematics in universities and some other institutes, and the main content of these critics was that how mathematics is defined and how it's tested in PISA, it's something that has very little to do with the real mathematics. But at the same time, many of these critics forgot that we are measuring mathematics in the context of compulsory education covering all 15-year-olds, and then the perspective coming, for instance, from university professors is quite limited from this point of view, or quite narrow from this point of view. But there were a lot of critical discussions, and the impact of this discussion can be seen here, how mathematical literacy was defined in 2015 PISA. It looks, to my mind, more traditional, some steps backwards into the traditional definition of mathematics. But this is also a good example how sensitive these issues are, and when they come into the public interest, when results are published in leading newspapers and everybody knows something about the results, then it activates also very critical discussions what we are actually measuring, and are we measuring the real things. And then it's always compromise of different perspective, and here we can see what was the compromise in mathematical literacy after all that discussion after 2003 PISA study. Maybe mathematics in PISA has been the most critical area in this sense, and I think it's also have been good for mathematical teaching of mathematics in schools, because it has raised some very basic questions. What is the role of school education related to this very long and strong tradition? Just to mention that important document, if you are interested about all these basics of large-scale assessment, in this case PISA, but the same practice is also in other international studies, are these frameworks, as they are called by researchers, where all these kind of definitions are set, and where they are coming, what is the background of these definitions, and also there are a lot of information which tell how tests are constructed based on these definitions, how they are categorized into different categories, for instance, in the contents of mathematics or processes in mathematics, different context of students' life, and so on. There are quite detailed descriptions about all this kind of issues, how we finally see what is behind all that, what we finally see as test booklets earlier on the tables of students nowadays in computers of students when they are answering the questions. A lot of work has been done before that. Huge amount of test items have been produced. Typically, in the final test, there's only 25% of the items which were in the beginning, or even smaller percentage of items which were originally created for the study, and also description how these expert groups have been working to do all this work. And here we are. I will show some examples about these tests, how they are constructed in PISA. I have this original. Oh, it was this. This is a typical PISA item or task in PISA booklet. First, there's a stimulus, as it's called. In this case, it's I think these original texts are from internet, taken from there. One favoring graffitis on that time, where there were, I think this was in 2000 or 2003, when the there was a lot of discussion about graffitis all over the world, one favoring and one opposing graffitis. And then test items, this was what students read first, and then they were asked to answer some questions. First, typically quite simple multiple choice questions and just testing if a student is able to find information from the text and repeating, recognizing that. And then in this case, there's guidelines for people who are scoring the students' answers. In this case, it's very simple because it was multiple choice, but this was everything was handwork in that time. That's why there are always this kind of guidelines. But then going ahead, there are more challenging questions, something that you have to interpret from the text and also give answers with your own words, and then it's coded for the database, following these guidelines, giving some examples. And then finally, the most demanding items for students, where they have to compare different perspectives and also evaluate how different writers are arguing their opinions and also make their own choices between that. This is very typical, or one example of typical PISA test in the beginning of the PISA program. The next one it's very different, but also tells something about what we mean by authentic assessment in PISA, or what it was meant on that time. It was using this kind of diagram about labor force, and there are questions about this diagram, different kind of questions, typically starting quite easy questions and then more and more demanding, and typically in the last items you have also to make your own statements, or make your own evaluations why you are answering in this way. And one challenge in this kind of studies is that we must have different kind of items, not only related to the contents of the processes or this kind of domain-specific issues, but also to the qualification of students. We must offer quite simple, easy, what happened now? Easy questions for students who are not so qualified, for instance, in mathematics, but also, on the other hand, very, very challenging items for students to be able to show their top knowledge. But I just still show one example about, it was this one. Some cases, these PISA tasks demand also a lot of reading. For instance, in this case, there are almost 3 pages of reading, and questions are coming that. So the authentic assessment means, for instance, in reading, that there are very different kind of questions, some very traditional like this, traditional reading, but also tasks with using different kind of material which are closer to the reality of today. Let's see. But then I would show another examples where we are heading today. PISA moved to computer-based assessment in 2015. It was the first time when the whole study was done in computer environment. And now we are in the beginning, or PISA is in the beginning of utilizing these possibilities. In this first study, where the science was the major area, these possibilities were still quite limited. Many of the items look quite traditional, but there are also this type of new tasks. For instance, in this case, simulation, where are three variables which are changing: temperature, humidity, and drinking water, yes or no. And then there are, I have to answer before I can go ahead. And students have to make some experiments, some studies, small studies to test what happens when temperature changes, humidity changes, are you drinking water or not. This is still instruction, and then there comes real items where they have to compare, for instance, different situations, and they see the results using these three variables. They see the results here, and then they have to make decision what is the answer to the question. This is still, of course, quite simple, but this only shows the way these international studies are heading today, and how we can utilize computers in these studies in the future. It's well, future will show it, but there are a lot of possibilities, but also a lot of challenges, because, for instance, scoring of students' answers in this kind of test is not always very simple. Then some experiences and ideas about possibilities to utilize data, PISA data, more effectively into different purposes, not only for league tables and comparing countries, their averages, and also what is the impact of PISA studies have been in some countries on political and level. Finland is very interesting exception compared to many other countries, even to other Nordic countries, is that in Finland the impact of study has been quite different, quite limited compared to these many other European countries, and maybe the main reason is that Finland has been doing so well. There has not been such a pressure in our case as in some other countries. But some effect there has been, and one effect is that it has really opened Finnish people to see where our system is compared to other countries. Differently compared to, let's say, France or Germany or some other big countries, strong countries, Finland has always been critical with its institutes and the results what we have managed to reach. And it has been also typical with education, that it has been, the public opinion has been, or was before PISA study, that Finnish education is not working very well. The results are quite poor compared to the aims in the national curriculum, and Finnish students are doing quite badly compared to students in other countries. But this was not based on anything. It was just a public opinion, and there were some national assessments which told that, for instance, the level of reading literacy is going down very, very fast, that it has there's dramatic decline in the reading literacy level of students. And when first PISA study came in 2000, Finland was #1 in reading, and this is how our leading newspaper was commenting on this finding, that our youngsters were on the top, and before that we thought that they are on the bottom. And in our case, the impact of study has been quite modest. I could say that after PISA 2006, where we were we were absolutely best country compared to all other countries, including all Asian countries, then the argumentation started to change, that maybe we have something to offer other countries, and maybe we are doing something right. And one reason, of course, was that so many people came to Finland to being interested in our educational system, and that started to change also our own understanding about our system. But then after 2012, when there has been quite a clear decline, it has also raised some worries about the results. In general level, we can see quite many impacts of PISA studies. Maybe the most critical is that it has raised a lot of that kind of discussions and political practices, that we need more control, we need more tests. For instance, in other Nordic countries, this has been the case. But it has also raised some quite strange processes, like these two examples, how to prepare students for PISA studies, to making PISA and other international studies like Olympic Games, how we prepare students. These examples are not from Asia. I think this is from some European countries. This is from Canada. So it's not only what happens in Asian countries, but also in other countries. It may create some very, very strange activities which are forgetting the main purpose of the study. And I think many of you know this letter to Mr. Andreas Schleicher, who is the main coordinator in OECD of PISA study, asking to stop the whole study. And that's why, of course, this kind of studies and working as a researcher in this kind of studies all the time raise very basic questions about the role of research, role of knowledge when we are thinking of the education of children and young people. Is it reasonable to compare national education systems? There are some arguments who are saying that the educational systems are, and they should be, so culturally bound institutions that there's no sense to compare them compare them to each other, and the results what they are producing are so national and closely related to national cultures. On the other hand, it's stressed, like in PISA, that many competencies, many qualifications, many skills and knowledge we need nowadays are shared by many nations and are global in many ways, and world is becoming global in this sense. And then one, of course, for researchers, basic question that do we need to know? Is it better not to know, as it's stated in this letter, that by stopping the study, it of course means that then we don't know very much about this kind of issues. As for researchers, on the other hand, it's very difficult to accept this kind of orientation that we don't need to know. Maybe at least my personal interest is to increase the knowledge, but then we have also to discuss and work a lot to develop our methods. Are they correct? Are we measuring correct things? Are they in line with the aims of curricula? Are they supporting the learning of children? Are they supporting the work of schools, of teachers, or are they disturbing educational practices in school level and classroom level? These are very basic questions what we have to raise all the time. And of course, the question and the answers are quite different if you compare what has happened in different countries. From perspective, from Finnish perspective, I would say that the impact has been quite positive. It has raised our awareness about the educational system, our understanding about how our system is working on national level and related to other countries. But in some other cases, in some other countries, we can see also examples how it has been damaging some good practices and also damaging the role of teachers as the professionals of education. But first, here I would like to raise some positive or examples which I consider positive from our point of view, and how we have tried to utilize all this huge data we have from PISA and other international studies to have social impact, positive social impact on our educational system. And first of all, what we have been trying to do in PISA and others is to keep always in mind that there's information that is in the interest of schools. And this is one challenge, how we are able to utilize this information for purposes of single schools, the teachers and principals and finally students. And our way is to report back to schools how they have been doing, but leave to making conclusions about the results schools themselves, to stressing that you have to check what kind of students you have had in the sample and also to analyze these results compared to some other factors which are typical for your own schools. And also always in our case that this is confidential interaction between researchers and schools. We never publish this kind of research in Finland, and we don't give these school-level results to anyone else. But our experience is that schools are really interested to see where they are going compared to national averages, international averages. Nowadays, more and more, not only on cognitive results, but also attitudes, self-efficacy, students' engagements, and other issues which are measured in PISA. What we are doing with the Ministry of Education, we try to develop our results into that kind of form that they can be used, for instance, in national policy making to raise strength and weaknesses of our system and to have impact in reforming legislation, national curriculum. And also we have some examples about national projects which have been launched based on findings, not only in our studies, but also in some other studies, which are, for instance, trying to strengthen motivation and well-being of students. Joy of reading is one challenge, especially among boys, and so on. National Board of Education, that is responsible of a national core curriculum, we are collaborating with them quite a lot. Our researchers are members in their expert groups. And for instance, in the present, in the new curriculum, national curriculum framework that was launched in 2016, it's stressing, for instance, issues like school culture, stressing the importance of students' motivation to develop instructional practices so that they are taking the needs, interest of students more into account. This kind of qualitative factors in school culture, and many cases they are argued with the findings from PISA studies and other studies, how to develop the quality of Finnish schools and learning environment. But also trying to develop our findings into the form that they can be utilized, for instance, in teacher in-service training and in different contexts. Teacher education and is area where we could do much more, and for instance, going more deeply into the different subject domains, mathematics, reading, science, to go item level, to open what kind of contents are familiar with Finnish students, especially where they are not doing so well, which are closely related to instructional practices and also the contents of different subjects in our school. But also analyzing the attitudinal factors of students, why the self-confidence or self-efficacy or engagement is quite low compared to other countries. Albeit the cognitive results are very high. Why Finnish students don't believe themselves, especially girls don't believe themselves as being good in mathematics, even they are doing very well in mathematics compared to Finnish boys or students in other countries. Media and the public is more and more important nowadays. Newspapers are nowadays quite interested also to make more deeper analysis about Finnish educational system, and that's the area where we have a lot of to do also in the future to support educational institutes in the national level, to make them more transparent for parents and other people outside the educational system. And then some examples about analysis, what we have done and what have been important for the Finnish discourse about our educational system. But just starting from this slide that shows one finding from all international studies that's always surprising me, that the results, if you take the average or take a look on, like here, on students who reach the minimum standards in science in this case, the variation between educational systems globally is huge. Even we know that length of education is quite similar in these different countries. There's not so big differences in that sense. Time they are using for instructional practices is not varying, or it's not correlating with these results. And this guys, that if we think of the perspective of students, we can say that educational systems are meeting the needs of students very unequally. If you think education as a global institute, that it should prepare young people to a global world, then we can say that they have very unequal opportunities for that, depending in which countries they are living. This is showing the number of students who don't reach the minimum standard. It's defined as a level 2. There are different levels in PISA and descriptions. What does it mean in the competencies? And this level 2 is considered as the minimum, and students who are below that level, starting from Macau, Estonia, below 10%, and some countries where it's also almost 70 or even more percentage of the population. So it's telling the huge variation. And the same, if we go to individual level, we can see the same also inside each country. For instance, in Finland, we can see that best performing students are many years. If we take best 10% of students, they are 6-7 years ahead of students which are on the bottom 10% of distribution of skills, for instance, in science. So this is one, we can see that variation between countries and between individual students is huge. And this is examples, how does it look in Finland and how it has changed in what is a trend, what has been the trend in science proficiency in Finnish educational system. And the worrying thing that has been discussed a lot as part of this reform on national curriculum, and today when we are discussing on the future basic education, comprehensive school, how does it look in 2020, 2030 and ahead. This is one of the starting point for that question. Why we used to have very few students not meeting that minimum standard. 2006 only 5%, now we have 12%, 9 years later 12% who are not reaching the minimum, and at the same time also top performing students on level 5 and 6 have declined. Why this has happened and what we should do. This is data that has been used a lot. Still we are doing very well with the averages compared to other countries. We are still one of the leading top countries, especially in reading and science, but not doing quite well also in mathematics. And here we can see also, when we take a look on these levels, that compared to OECD countries, we are doing quite well. But we should not be satisfied on that we are doing well compared to other countries. We should be worried about those students whose skills, whose competencies are not good enough for the future life. One interesting feature of Finnish education that has been found in many studies, also in PISA, is that girls are outperforming boys on all three domains, including mathematics, where boys traditionally have been better than girls. Nowadays, girls are outperforming boys in Finland, also here. In OECD countries, on average, it's slightly different. But you can see here that why this gender issue is so much discussed in Finland. If you think of the potential that students, boys and girls, have after when they are ending their compulsory education, it makes a difference for their further studies and their studies in secondary and tertiary education. Maybe the most important and worrying finding that from the perspective of educational policy is that the impact of socio-economic background is increasing quite dramatically in Finland. This is just comparing what is the impact of this SES on science scale points in 2006 and now 2015. You can see that earlier we used to be a country where this correlation was smaller than on OECD countries on average, among the smallest in all countries. Today we are very close to OECD average, and of course one question for the further studies is why this has happened, and is it because of educational system, or is it because of changes in Finnish society, or what is behind that? Immigrant students in Finland seems to be quite challenging how we meet their needs, because difference between non-immigrant and immigrant students is bigger than in other Nordic countries. Here it's only from 2015, but if we compare to Sweden, Norway, Denmark, these differences are bigger, especially when we compare non-immigrant and second generation immigrant students. Second generation immigrants are children who were born in Finland, whose parents moved to Finland. Why we have not managed to raise their level as high as non-immigrant students, even they have been born in Finland? That's a challenge for the system, for the Finnish educational system. One strength of the Finnish system, what we can see in these international comparisons is this between school variation. We have a lot of discussions, and we have some national studies which show today that the between school variation differences between schools in their learning outcomes are increasing in metropolitan area, Helsinki, and some other big cities in southern part of the country, and Turku and some other countries. But on international level, if you take the whole country and compare ourselves to other countries, we still are in quite equal country related to learning outcomes in different schools. But of course, here we have to combine national and international studies and analyze them together. Maybe what is happening now in some parts of the country, big cities, is taking place in other parts later. And there are a lot of questions nowadays, what is behind of the declining results of the Finnish students. Even we are, as I said, we are still doing very well, but the trend is negative. And this is one indicator about the changing behavior of the students related to some factors which are very important to support learning in school. Reading for fun, how much students spend time for reading outside the school lessons. And you can see here that the number of students who don't read at all outside school time has increased dramatically from 2000 to 2015. 2000, we were a very exceptional country in that sense that only 20% of students said that they don't read at all outside of school lessons. Now it's almost 40%, much closer to OECD average, when we used to be very reading country, especially girls were reading a lot, much more than that girls in other countries on that time. Also, attitudes and this motivation, self-efficacy, this kind of issues are interesting from our point of view because we are on low level, as I said, compared to cognitive results. Also, students' interest, in this case, into science-related factors here, science occupations, but also some other science-related factors are quite low in Finnish. Besides also telling a lot about the school culture, this is an example about assessment practices in school level, and this is confirming our experience that Finnish teachers are not controlled very much in their classrooms, that they are quite independent and autonomous professionals in their classrooms. When we are asking principals how much they are following teachers' teaching, how much teachers are following each other's teaching and so on, we are very low level compared to many other countries. I don't say if it's a good or bad thing, it can be both, but compared to other countries, we are very unique in that sense that teachers are monitored at all or very little in our schools. Also about the educational system in Finland, teacher union is all the time demanding that the class sizes should be smaller to guarantee well-being of students and teachers and so on. In international context, Finnish classrooms, the medium size of Finnish classrooms is smaller than in any other country, but this has had no impact on political discourse or on these demands, but this is the fact. Also, what is interesting from our perspective, that students' total learning time is smallest in Finland. This is covering all lessons in school, homework, and private tutoring, this kind of issues. Huge differences between countries, and Finland is, in this sense, on the bottom. And it's typical to Finland and other Nordic countries to keep school time and free time very clearly separate. It is a very different situation compared especially to Asian countries. And if we compare this to our scale points, we can see in this way we can say that we are still on the top compared to time what we are using for teaching. We are best among countries participating in PISA. Okay, here was my story today, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, so thank you very much, Jouni, for this rich description of the international comparison studies and the current findings. Now we still have time, and if there are questions or comments, please. Do we have a microphone? Any questions?
Everything is clear. I was fighting a lot of critics because many researchers, especially in educational sector, have been, as you saw, being quite critical. So I would be also happy to hear that kind of comments.
So maybe then after this session, during probably some coffee or something. So okay, thank you very much.